Play is essentially a poem. It's a poem written for two voices, or three voices, or four voices. So the lines have to be rhythmic and beautiful, if you can, because they aren't about conveying information. For example, Churchill says, "We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them in the fields. We will fight them on the landing fields. We will never surrender." And he could have just said, "We're going to fight." But his speech created an idea in the minds of its hearers. The poetry of Churchill, which comes right out of his love of Shakespeare and of the King James Bible, and it's the same cadences, encouraged the British people who were beaten in 1939. There was no way that they could have defeated the Nazis. There was no way, except Churchill said, "We're going to win. We will never, ever surrender." And he said, "It may be our fate to drown in a welter of our own blood. And that's preferable to living under the Nazis." And he wasn't talking to the Nazis, he was talking to his fellow Brits, who said, "Yes, that's true, we are like that." But they weren't like that until Churchill said it. Then they realized they were like that. So that's the power of poetry. Dr. King's a perfect example. "I Have a Dream." The speech changed America, right? He was speaking prophecy, he was speaking poetry. And he could have spoken like a politician. Nobody listens to a politician because it might be true, but it's all drivel, right? But when you put it in poetry, which has an element of prophecy in it, it has the capacity to move souls. Some people have a gift to write poetry and others don't. And great poetry has the capacity to move, and it works itself into the mind. Like if you read Shakespeare, you're going to remember a lot of Shakespeare. Even if it's only a phrase, you remember a lot of them. You read Rudyard Kipling, or you read, say, for example, Coleridge or Keats or Shelley or those guys, you remember it. These glossy magazines today are publishing drivel that they call poetry. You can't remember one. If I said to you, "Okay, I'll give you $1 billion if you can quote me that poem tomorrow," you couldn't remember it. The poetry is the stuff that you want to shout back and forth to each other across the hall. There are certain cultures that I've encountered that communicate by telling stories or by telling jokes, or one of them is the Jewish culture. We communicate by telling stories, by telling jokes. And we grew up in a mixed neighborhood, an African American and a Jewish, and we all used to play the dozens on each other, right? Just on Stony Island Avenue. And status was awarded for the ability to be witty, to be funny, and to be trenchant, right? As it is in the Italian community, as it is in the law enforcement community. If you can tell a good story, if you can come up with a good line, you get a lot of status. There was a guy called Beau Brummel, and he was a dandy in the reign of, I think, George III in England. And everybody didn't have any money, but he was famous because he was so witty. I mean, he came to a club one day, and somebody said, "Oh, Mr. Brummel, you seem to be limping. What's the matter?" He said, I've hurt my right leg, and it's my favorite leg." So all of a sudden, everybody in London is just saying, "Yeah," like they're giving this son of a bitch a noogie. "Get over it, you son of a bitch, yeah." Do that thing about So we grew up with the ability to tell stories and to tell jokes was very highly prized. Also, I think we were fairly common middle-class 1950 Jewish neurotic family, and we drove each other crazy. So the ability to inflict damage neurotically on your dearest and most beloved family members was highly prized. "Oh yeah" wouldn't cut it, And so the Jews have always loved language. I mean, there's never been an illiterate Jew. And you go back and you read the Torah, in the original, it's it's very, very pithy. I mean, it's like street corner language. We get used to interpreting the Bible as in most of Western culture in English in the King James version, which is all full of prithys and wherefores and that stuff. But the original language is very, very punchy. Some people can write dialogue and some people can't. I think most people can because it's just gossip. You make that up all day long. He said, she said. What happens is something kicks in, something artificial kicks in between what we do naturally and our ability to do it when we say it's art. And I think that thing which kicks in is called education, which is the worst thing to happen since kale. But there are a lot of people who do it naturally. We're talking about cultures that prize the ability to speak poetically, and one of them is African American culture, another is Jewish culture, another is the Irish in storytelling, and the Italians in street culture. And there was a guy called Lou Ippolito. Lou Ippolito was a cop in New York, and he wrote a book called Mafia Cop. Because his family was all mafia, they'd all been members of, and I think eventually killed by the Gambino family. And Lou says, no, I'm going to go straight. I'm going to be a straight up cop. And he goes and he wrote a book called Mafia Cop about his experiences as a straight up police officer. And he was eventually convicted of, while being a police officer, of committing 70 murders for the Gambino family. And he went to prison. He's in prison. He's in prison forever, right? And I used to hang out with him because he was a good friend. But before he was convicted, he was a good friend of Boom Boom Mancini, Ray Boom Boom Mancini, champion of the world. And Boom Boom knew everybody. And we have this luncheon club in Santa Monica at a place we all call The Joint. Everybody goes there every day for lunch. There's a lot of cops and a lot of jiu-jitsu fighters and pilots and bouncers and stuntmen. It's really great. And so one time Lou is over there and he starts talking about his some stakeout he'd been on. He says he comes in from a stakeout and he says, I look like I stink because I do stink. I've been sitting in a car for 5 days. And there's a beautiful mafia kid, a connected kid there. And the kid is all tugged out with the $10,000 suit. He's got gold all over. His nails are done and he's gorgeous. He looks like a movie star. And they've been asking him for information. And the kid's not giving up information. So Lou says, so I say to the guys, I say, excuse me a second. Would you leave the room? They leave the room, and he says, kid, you got a lot of good looks, and you got a lot of information. And one of those two motherfuckers is staying in this room. Like, fuck. That's the best thing I ever heard anybody say. And of course the cops, they prize verbal acuity. They love to tell stories, put in his put it the best way possible. So a lot of us have that ability, and some of us don't. Like, I'm always struck at people who don't know how to tell a joke. I always think, well, anybody can tell a joke. Well, how can you tell a joke that badly? But some people don't hear it. Most people do. My sainted grandmother spoke very, very broken English and very accented English. She didn't understand English very well. I just loved listening to her. I remember, there's a couple of stories I've told about her, I think, before, is my dad would speak to her and say, Ma, we're going to move you into this other apartment, but in the interim, I want you to stay here. In the interim, I think bibbidi-bobbidi-boo. So she says, buddy, when you say the interim, do you mean the vestibule? So that was my grandmother. One time he's saying, Ma, he said, I see you've been doing this and that, blah, blah, blah. In lieu of that, I'd rather you do this. In lieu of that, I'd rather you do this. So she said, buddy, who is this Lou? So she was an old country Yiddish mama. And one of the first plays I ever wrote was about these two old Jewish DPs, displaced persons, sitting on a bench in Lincoln Park in Chicago called the Duck Variations. And they're two old Jewish guys talking about ducks. And I was very influenced, of course, not only by my grandparents. I mean, everybody I knew, their grandparents came from the old country. There was nobody in my neighborhood whose grandparents didn't grow up speaking Russian and Yiddish. So I was exposed to that. And I just read a book by Aaron Copland, the great composer and theoretician, teacher of music. And I think it was called Theme and Variations. I think it was called that. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be cool to write a series of variations, but instead of writing it musically, to write it dramatically. So these two guys do, in effect, I think there are 14 variations on a theme of talking about ducks. So that was that idea. Two old guys sitting on a park bench. I love to read. If I'm not writing, I'm usually reading. And it's like having a different language. You say if you got another language, you got another soul, right? You also get a chance in reading to see how other people observe human interactions. I read some great genius writers and say, man, that's great. And as I said before, not that I want to be just like him or her, but now I see what people, that it's I'm capable of ascribing to that sort of concision or poetry, if you will. And most of the writers I read, it's not so much the dialogue that I appreciate, although I'll mention three of them. One of them is George V. Higgins, who was a assistant district attorney in Boston for many years and wrote about 30 novels about Boston, the interaction between the criminal world and the legal world in Boston. He was a genius. Another one was Patrick O'Brian, who wrote 22 sea novels taking place during the Napoleonic Wars. And he just died about 15 years ago in his 90s. And the third was John le Carré, who had, of course, been a spy and wrote about the secret world. And their dialogue is just spectacular. And we mentioned Hemingway, and I'm sure I'll think of a whole bunch more. Another one is Dawn Powell, who wrote in the 40s and 50s in New York City. Nobody reads her much anymore. Great writer. There's a piece that Hemingway wrote in a book called Islands in the Stream, and it takes place in, there's this painter, a famous painter who's the hero, and writers always love to pick painters for their heroes because they think, oh my God, I'm being a writer, I loathe every second of it except the time that I don't, and then I loathe myself for being proud of myself. But painters, man, they got it easy. They just sit down and blah, blah, blah. They paint a little bit of this, but they must have it really easy. So writers love having painter heroes. So this painter hero, and who's divorced from a movie star. And he hasn't seen a woman movie star in years and years and years. And it's during World War II, and our painter hero is living in Cuba. And the movie star shows up, the woman movie star, and they have a bunch of drinks. And they take a walk on the beach. And they have a son who's in the Air Force. They take a walk, and out of nowhere, he says, it's the boy, isn't it? She says, yeah. He says, he's dead, isn't he? She says, sure. It's genius.